Okay, these are all the pieces you need to make the little girl's pajamas. And these usually come in size 1.5 to 8 years old. So in order to get a smaller size, you can see this pattern goes from 1/2 to 3, and I would get tracing paper and I would copy the smaller size onto the original pattern. To begin, we're going to start with the yokes, the front and the back. And the first thing we're going to do, we're going to stay stitch the neckline of the front yoke both sides. We're also going to do the back, and we're going to stay stitch the neckline both sides of the yoke, left and right, and we're going to stay stitch a 1/4 inch on your machine. After you finish doing that, come back and we'll continue. Your pieces should now look like this, where you've stay stitched the top of the neckline of the back yoke, and you've stay stitched the neckline of both sides of the front yoke. Next step, what it wants you to do, it wants you to sew a 5/8 seam up to that dot and back stitch in the beginning to secure your stitch first before we go on to the next step. Okay, I've gone ahead and I've sewed from that point, back stitch, come back, I've sewed down to secure my seam. And now when you open it, this is the back yoke and you have your 2 pieces. Now what it wants you to do, it wants you to connect them at the shoulders. So what you want to do, the right side's always being together, and if you notice, there's notches on your pattern, and that's so that you can connect pieces together. If you notice, there's a notch here too. So what you're going to do is you're going to put this together and make sure your notches are matched up, and you're going to sew across, and you're going to do it for both sides of your yoke. Do that and come back and we'll continue. Now that you've sewn the shoulders together from back to front, your pieces should look like this. Here's the front yoke attached to the back yoke, and the other piece of the front yoke attached to the back. This next step is only if you have a serger and want to clean up your edges. What I do is I will cut them down to maybe that size right there, and I will take it to the serger and I will finish my edges. But if you don't, each sewing machine has a capability of zigzagging, and you could zigzag it, anything to clean up those edges. Okay, this is the luxury of having a serger. See these little threads? What it does, it really secures each stitch, and it stitches almost like what my dad would say, caballito. We're going to do something different with this back seam. Using bias tape, an easy way to put a hem in any seam, we're going to put the bias tape and sew it on the top of all the yoke. So here is my bias tape, and they suggest a 1/2 inch. And this is really great because what you do is you open it up one side, and where you sewed before on the material will kind of be your guide. So when you put these two together and you sew them, they'll be sewed, and when you turn the material around, you'll have a clean finish. I've gone ahead and I've taken my 1/2 inch bias tape and I've opened up the top and I've pinned it to the edge of my yoke, and I'll secure it all the way across, and we'll do each section at a time, and then I will sew a 1/4 inch at the very top. All right, so now that we pressed it, our seam is flat and it looks nicer. And we're going to take it to the machine and we're just going to sew real close along here. The reason why we do it, it helps the binding when you turn it over lay flat. Now that you've sewed directly close to the seam, not on this side, but on this side, it's going to help you when you turn your seam over. It gives it a better way to lay flat. So what I did to make it easier, I sewed on this side so I could make sure I caught the bias tape. And when you turn it over, it looks beautiful. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take a piece of the bias tape. We're going to take 2.5 inches of a bias tape and we're going to fold it in half, sew the top. And what we're going to do, we're going to take the left side of the yoke and we're going to sew it here to the end. I've measured out 2.5 inches of bias tape and we're going to take it to machine. We're going to fold it in half and we're going to sew on top of it, top seam, and we're going to stop at the blue and then cut it. And this is what we're going to use for the button. Now that you've finished sewing the buttonhole on the left side of the yoke, it should look like this. Now that you press the first seam open wide all the way to the end, we've pressed over a 1/4 down each side. Press it really flat with your iron. And when we go to sew, we're going to bring this loop over and we're going to stitch close to the top on each sides. After you're done sewing down each edge, remembering to fold this over before sewing the seam, you should have a clean finish that looks like this. The reverse of it will be ready, and there's your buttonhole. You've sewed down each side, and all we need after is to sew a button there. And the back is done. So what we're going to do now is only taking the front yoke. We're going to overlap the left side to the right side, matching these small little notches that you have down here. And we're going to sew across to keep it together. Do that and come back and we'll go to the next step. Now that you've done sewing across, the two front yokes are connected so they won't move, and we're ready for the next step. Gather the front. Make sure that you have the front, not the back. And we're going to use our longest stitch and we're going to baste 2 lines at the top, which we'll use to gather the bottom to the top yoke. Do that and come back and we'll go using our longest stitch. We sewed 2 on top and we were able to gather it by pulling the string on each side, and it made a little gathering before we sew the yoke. Okay, once you've pinned the 2 sides together, the yoke and the bottom of the blouse together, and you pinned the gathering tight enough so that it fits across, you're going to sew 5/8 across the top. When you're through, you can pull out these long strings that were your basting, and you should be left with a nice seam. Okay, I've sewn across, connecting the right and left front yoke to the front bottom. And you should have something that looks like this. And what I'll do is I'll take it to the serger and I'll trim down my seam a 4th way, and I'll serge it, and I'll be right back. Now that the seam has been pressed, you're going to take, it's an option, rickrack or lace or anything you want to put decorative, and we're going to sew directly across the front. Now we're going to work on the back piece, and we're going to attach the back bottom to the back yoke. So we're going to be doing the same thing as we did to the front. We're going to, with the longest stitch, make 2 lines across here from notch to notch, and we're going to pull it so it gathers so that this piece fits perfectly with this piece, matching up the notches. Remember, the good sides facing each other. Do that and come back and we'll go to the next. Okay, we have attached the back yoke to the back piece. I've taken it to the serger, and I've finished my edges. And now I'm going to put ribbon. I'm going to sew it directly on top of this line seam so they don't see it, so it could be exactly like the front. Okay, I'm going to sew that, and we should be good to sew up the sides. Now the lace has been sewn on the back side of the blouse, and now we're going to be ready to sew up the sides. Next step will be sewing up the sides of the blouse. So you want to pin, matching these notches, you want to pin it all the way down so the material doesn't move, and you want to sew a 5-inch seam all the way down, and you'll be doing it on both sides. Okay, I've sewed my edges, I've trimmed the seams, and I've taken it to the serger, and I've serged the edges on both sides. So by now, your shirt or blouse should look like this. Next, what we're going to do, we're going to take it to the ironing board and press really good your seams, and we're going to start working on the sleeves. Now that we're done with the sides of the shirt, we're going to be working on the sleeves. So we're going to do what we did for the front and the back bottom piece. We're going to gather around the top of the sleeve by stitching with the longest stitch and pulling together. We're going to sew down the seams. We're going to attach rickrack around the sleeves before we attach it to the armholes. After preparing my sleeve, gathering at the top, I measured up 1 1/4 that will be the hem, and from there 1 inch up where I will put the lace. And we'll do that before we sew the sides of the sleeve, which will make it easier. Okay, so I went ahead and I sewed across on the line we drew. Remember, it's 1 1/4 for the hem and 1 inch up from the hem. And this blue, don't worry about it because it's washable. Now we're going to sew up the sides of the sleeve. So we're going to bring the 2 right sides together, and again trying to match the little grooves. You're going to sew down, and then I'll be trimming and serging the sides. Do that on both sleeves. Come back and we'll get to the next. I went ahead and I folded up 1 1/4, and then I folded up to the line, first line, and doubled over. So from the sewing where you sewed the rickrack to the edge of here is exactly 1 inch from here to here. And that's your hem, so I'm going to take it to the machine and I'm going to sew. Now that we've sewed the rickrack on, we've hemmed it up, The sides are already sewn. We need to attach this to the armhole. Now we're going to attach the sleeve to the armhole, and we're pinning around, securing each dot that is in here matches with the dot that's on the outside, and making sure that when we pin the seam, it's going to match up perfectly at the end with the seam on the outside. So take it to your machine. You're going to sew all the way around. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim my seam like always and serge it, and then I'll be back. Okay, I finished sewing around the sleeve and I went ahead and serged it. So that's all taken care of. The last thing we need to do is hem the bottom of the shirt, and as you could see, I've marked 1 1/4 for the hem allowance, and I've also pressed down to turn over, and we'll be turning it over one more. We'll be sewing close to the end all the way around, finishing the hem, and we should be through. So I will see you after that gets done. Okay, I've gone ahead and I've sewn close to the edge, and I've made the hem. So the nightshirt looks actually very good. There's your button loop, and all we'll need to do later is sew on the button. Next time we'll make the pajamas. Now that we finished the top of the pajama, we're going to work on the pajamas bottoms, which are very simple, and what you have are 2 big pieces, and one piece is actually half of the back and half of the front. It doesn't seem possible, but it's fast and it's easy. So let's get started. You should now have 2 leg pieces, a 5/8 of a seam sewed in the inner leg. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to trim down my seam down to half, and I'm going to take it to the serger, and I'm going to secure my edges, and then we'll go on to the next step. I've secured my edges with the serger on both of the pieces. We're ready to go to the next step. Just like the drawing shows, we're going to stick one leg pants inside the other, making sure to match up your seam. Now that I've pinned and secured all the way around, making sure that I match this up so the seam on each side match perfectly, I'm going to take it to the machine. I'm going to sew a 5/8 seam. I'll be trimming it down like normal and serging the edges. Do that and come back and we'll go to the next step. Now that you're done, you should have sewed 5 1/4 inch all the way around, making sure that this seam matches on both sides exactly. And then I trimmed it down and I secured it with my serger. So now what we're going to do is we're going to turn it inside out, and you should have pants. So now that you're done and you have this, you're going to pull the pants leg through. Keep pulling until everything is out, and you should come out with a pair of pants. The next step, we're going to be making the casing at the top of the pajamas so we could insert the elastic and finish the top. So to make the casing, what I've done is I've measured 1 inch down, and I've made dots all along so that I could know where to fold it down to make the casing where we could insert the elastic. Okay, so I've gone around and I pinned my waistband, and the marks where I had marked in blue, the 1 inch, That's where the fold goes. But before I did that, I just folded over a fourth. So when we sew this, there'll be no raw edges. We'll just make a crease. You want to determine which is the front of your pants and which is the back. And in the back, you're going to leave a space open so that you could insert the elastic when you're through. Okay, so I went ahead and I folded over an inch for the casing, and I left what I determined from the back, a space open. See how I have a fourth turned over? So when you sew, it'll come out nice. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert this elastic into one end, and until it fits all the way around, according to the child's waist. The last thing we needed to do was hem. So we turned up 1 1/4 to the inside, and we stitched all the way around, and that completes your pajamas. So your pajamas are complete and they're ready to go. Congratulations.